I never thought the person who would take my home from me would be someone I once rocked to sleep. That's the part they don't tell you. Everyone warns you about strangers, about con artists and scammers and people who call pretending to be your grandchild in trouble. Nobody warns you that the one who chips away at everything you've built, quietly, steadily, with a smile on their face, might be the child you raised, standing right beside the man she married. My name is Hannah. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a registered nurse at Mercy General, and I have held people's hands while they took their last breath. I have seen the worst of what life can do to a body. I thought that had made me strong. I thought nothing could rattle me. I was wrong. My husband, Gerald, died 2 years ago this past March. Pancreatic cancer. 4 months from diagnosis to the end, that's all we got. We had been married 38 years, and in 4 months, he was gone. In the way that a dress feels enormous when you've lost too much weight, like something that used to fit you perfectly, now just hangs there, reminding you of what's missing. I have one daughter, Diane. She lived about 40 minutes away with her husband, Marcus. They had been together 9 years, married for 6. I tried to like Marcus from the beginning. I really did. He was charming in that careful way that some men are charming, the kind where you sense the effort behind it, like watching someone hold a smile for too long in a photograph. But Diane loved him. And that was enough for me. I kept my opinions to myself. When Gerald died, Diane was the one who came and stayed with me for the first 2 weeks. She slept in the guest room, made coffee every morning, sat with me while I cried. I am grateful for that. I want to be clear about that, because what came later doesn't erase what came before. She was my daughter, and she showed up. That mattered. What I didn't know during those 2 weeks was that things at home were not good. Not the grief, kind of not good. The financial kind. I found out in pieces. First, it was a comment Diane made in passing something about Marcus's business being slow. He had a small landscaping company, had run it for about 5 years. I nodded and said I was sorry to hear that. Then, about 3 months after Gerald's funeral, Diane called and asked if she could borrow $300 to cover a car payment. I sent it without question. A month later, it was $500 for a utility bill. I sent that too. I didn't keep track. She was my daughter. Then, one Sunday evening in October, Diane and Marcus came over for dinner. I made pot roast, Gerald's favorite, because I was still cooking for a ghost and couldn't seem to stop. We ate, we talked, and after the plates were cleared, Diane reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. She said they were in trouble, real trouble. Marcus's biggest contract had fallen through. They were 3 months behind on rent, and their landlord had given them 30 days to vacate. She said they had nowhere to go. She looked at me with her father's eyes. She has always had Gerald's eyes, and she asked if they could stay with me. Just until Marcus got the business back on track. They would pay their own groceries, help around the house, keep to themselves, she promised. I said yes. I want you to understand something about that moment. I was lonely in a way I had never been in my adult life. I was rattling around in a 4-bedroom house by myself, eating cereal for dinner 3 nights a week, and some mornings I would walk to the kitchen and be startled by how quiet it was. Having Diane under my roof again felt like something coming back. It felt like a small warmth returning to a cold house. I said yes, because she was my daughter, and she needed help. Yes. But I also said yes because I was tired of the silence. They moved in the first Saturday of November. The first few weeks were fine. Better than fine, actually. Diane cooked on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Marcus took out the trash without being asked. We watched television in the evenings sometimes, the 3 of us, and it felt almost like a family again. Almost. The first sign was small enough that I almost missed it. Marcus asked me one afternoon if he could use my home address for his business. His old one, the apartment address, was no longer valid, and he said he needed something stable for his LLC registration and his insurance paperwork. It seemed reasonable. It was just an address. I said yes. The second sign came in December. I had a particular arrangement of things on the mantel in the living room. Gerald's watch. A photo from our anniversary trip to the Smoky Mountains. A small ceramic cardinal that my mother had given me before she passed. One evening, I came downstairs and the watch was gone. The photo had been moved to the side. And in the center of the mantel, there was a large potted succulent I had never seen before. I stood there for a moment, just looking at it. I asked Diane about it. She said Marcus had bought it because the mantel looked bare. And wasn't it pretty? I said I preferred the watch and the photo there. She said she would talk to Marcus. The watch came back. The photo did not. And the succulent stayed. I told myself it was just a plant. In January, I noticed that Marcus had started using my kitchen table as his office. He had a second monitor set up, cables running across the wood, file folders stacked where Gerald and I used to do the crossword. He would be there in the mornings when I came down for coffee, earbuds in, already on calls. I started taking my coffee to the sunroom. I told myself it was temporary. He was rebuilding the business. He needed space. I told myself a lot of things. By February, Marcus had taken over the garage for equipment storage. Bags of mulch, a spare mower, metal shelving that went up to the ceiling, Gerald's workbench, where he had spent 20 years tinkering with small things, a radio, a birdhouse he never finished. A clock was completely buried. I asked Marcus if we could keep one corner clear for Gerald's things. He said sure, absolutely, he'd get to it soon. He never did. Diane had stopped cooking on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She was tired, she said. Work had been stressful. I understood. But the kitchen became a different place. There were protein powder containers on the counter, where the bread box used to be. The mugs I had used every morning for 15 years were moved to the back of the cabinet to make room for a set of matching ones they'd brought from their apartment. The first time I reached for my mug and found something else, I stood there in front of the open cabinet for a long moment, feeling something I didn't have a name for yet. I started to say things, small things, gently. I asked if we could keep the kitchen organized the way I was used to. I mentioned that I'd like the table back in the mornings, or at least a few mornings a week. I said that I appreciated everything they were doing, but that it was still my home, and I needed to feel comfortable in it. Diane would nod and say, "Of course. Mom, you're right. We'll figure it out." And then nothing would change. I didn't push. I kept telling myself, they're going through a hard time. They are my family. This is temporary. March came. Then, April. The few months had stretched to 6, and there was no talk of leaving. When I gently asked Diane how the apartment search was going, she would say they were looking, that rentals were so expensive right now, that Marcus needed a couple more good contracts before they could commit to anything. I would nod. And then I would go to the sunroom and sit with my coffee and look at the backyard. Gerald had spent 20 years building the roses, the Japanese maple he planted for our 25th anniversary, the stone path he laid himself, one afternoon in late summer, and I would remind myself that none of this was their fault, that I had offered, that family takes care of each other. But something had shifted in me by then. I could feel it, the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. Something had been accumulating, stone by stone, and the pile was getting heavy. In the first week of May, I had a cardiology appointment. Nothing serious, just a follow-up for a murmur my doctor had been monitoring for 3 years. I drove myself, spent about 2 hours at the clinic, and stopped on the way home at the grocery store to pick up a few things. I was gone for most of the day. When I pulled into my driveway that afternoon, there was a car parked out front that I didn't recognize, a dark blue sedan with out-of-state plates. I sat in my car for a moment, looking at it, trying to think of who it could belong to. I assumed maybe someone visiting the neighbors. I went inside. In my guest room, the room where Diane had slept after Gerald died, the room with the quilt my mother made, the room I had kept ready for visitors, there was a man I had never seen before. He was about 30 years old, with a rolling suitcase open on the floor, and his toiletries spread out on the dresser. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway. He seemed confused, but not alarmed. He said, "Hi, is there a problem?" I said, "Yes, there is a very large problem." "Who are you, and how did you get into my house?" He said he had booked through the app. He said he had a confirmation. He pulled out his phone and showed me a listing. My guest room, my address, my house, listed on Airbnb at $85 a night, with photos Marcus had clearly taken while I was out the bed with my mother's quilt, the window with the lace curtains I had hung myself 20 years ago, the nightstand with the lamp Gerald bought me for my 50th birthday. I stood in that doorway and I felt the floor shift under me. I told the man, as calmly as I could, that there had been a serious mistake, that he had been listed a room that was not available to rent, and that I was the owner of this house and had known nothing about this. I told him he was not at fault and that he would be fully refunded, but that he would need to leave. He was decent about it. He packed his suitcase, and I walked him to the door, and I watched him drive away in the dark blue sedan. Then I sat down on the porch steps, and I put my face in my hands. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that the light changed and the birds went quiet. Long enough that I thought about Gerald and what he would have said if he were here. Gerald was a quiet man, but he was not a passive one. He would have known exactly what to do. He would have walked back inside that house and handled it with the kind of calm authority that comes from knowing your own ground. I thought about what he would have wanted me to do. When I heard the front door open behind me, I stood up. Diane and Marcus had come home. They had groceries in their arms and were laughing about something. Marcus saw my face first, and his smile went still in the way a smile does when a person suddenly realizes they've been caught. I asked him, very quietly, to explain the Airbnb listing. There was a pause. He put the groceries down on the porch railing. He said he had meant to tell me about it. He said it was just extra income, that the room was just sitting there empty, that it wasn't hurting anyone. He said they had been careful to only book it when I had appointments or was going to be out. He said it was just a few times, not a big deal. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at the ground. I asked her if she knew. She said she had found out a few weeks ago and hadn't wanted to start a fight. She said Marcus had thought it would be fine. She said she was sorry, but also that we could talk about it rationally. I told them both, still quietly, that I needed them to go inside and that I needed a few minutes. I walked around to the backyard. I stood at Gerald's Japanese maple, which was coming into its spring color, and I put my hand on the bark the way I had seen him do 100 times, like checking in on an old friend. And I made a decision. I did not scream. I did not cry. I went back inside, sat down at the kitchen table Marcus's equipment had been pushed to one side, and I moved it further and sat in the center, and I told them to sit down. I told Marcus that he had listed my home for rent without my knowledge or consent. I told him that as the owner of this property, I had never agreed to that, and that it constituted using my real estate for commercial purposes without authorization. I told him that the business address he had registered to my home also needed to be removed, because I was withdrawing that permission effective immediately. He started to say something about how I was overreacting. I held up my hand. I told him I wasn't finished. I told them both that when they moved in, I had said a few months. It had been 6. I told them that my home had been gradually rearranged, occupied, and used for purposes I had never agreed to, and that I had said things, smaller things, along the way, and been nodded at and ignored. I told them that I was their family and not their landlord, their property manager, or their business address, and that the two things were not interchangeable. I told them they had 60 days to find other housing. I put it in writing that same night, a formal notice addressed to both of them, stating the date they had moved in, the date of our conversation, and the date by which they needed to vacate. I looked up the proper format online. I used my own address at the top. I signed it. I slid a copy under the guest room door, which was now, for the first time in months, going to be used only for guests. I also called Airbnb the next morning. I reported the unauthorized listing, explained that I was the homeowner and had no knowledge of or consent to it, and requested that it be removed and that any future bookings be canceled with full refunds. The representative was helpful and efficient. The listing was down within hours. I also contacted the county clerk's office to find out how to have Marcus's business registration removed from my address. It took 2 weeks and a few phone calls, but it was done. Diane called me 4 times in the first 3 days after the conversation. The first 2 calls I let go to voicemail. She left messages saying she was sorry, that Marcus had been wrong, that she hoped I wouldn't let this ruin their relationship. The 3rd call I answered. She cried. She said she didn't know what they were going to do. I told her that I loved her, that I would always love her, and that none of that changed anything about the 60 days. She said I was being cold. I thought about the man with his rolling suitcase in my guest room, standing beside my mother's quilt that I had never offered to anyone. And I said I was being clear. Marcus never apologized. Not in words. He became very quiet in the house after that, and when we passed in the hallway, he would look at a point just past my ear. I did not need his apology. What I needed was the date on the calendar to arrive. They left on a Thursday, a week before the 60 days were up. I don't know if they found an apartment or if they were staying somewhere temporary. Diane texted me to let me know they had gotten the last of their things. I texted back and said, "Thank you for letting me know." It was the most honest thing I could offer in that moment. I walked through the house that Thursday evening like I was meeting it again for the first time. The succulent was gone from the mantel. I put Gerald's photo back in its place. I found his watch in the drawer where I had relocated it months ago, when the whole mantel had been rearranged around things that weren't mine, and I set it back where it belonged. I opened the garage. The shelving was still there. They had left the equipment, but taken the most portable pieces. I stood in front of Gerald's workbench and started clearing it, piece by piece, until I could see the wood surface again. It took about an hour. When it was done, I sat on the old stool he used to use, in the quiet of my own garage, and I let myself feel whatever that feeling was. Not triumph, not grief, exactly. Something more like reclamation. I rehung the kitchen cabinets the way they had been before. I brought my old mugs back to the front. I moved the bread box to where the bread box belongs and put the protein powder containers on the high shelf, because I decided to donate them rather than throw them out, and that seemed like a reasonable place to wait. I made myself a pot of coffee and I sat at my kitchen table and I did the crossword. I got 11 across wrong and I didn't care. A few weeks later, I sat down with my attorney, a woman named Patricia who had handled Gerald's estate and who I trusted completely. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I was done, she said she wanted to look at a few things: the business registration, the Airbnb liability questions, some paperwork related to who was listed, in what capacity, on which accounts. We spent 2 hours going through things I had not looked at carefully enough while I was still in the fog of grief and loneliness and just wanting someone in the house. I also updated my will. That was my decision, and I made it calmly, without anger, the same way I had made every other decision in those weeks. Not as punishment, as clarity, as a reflection of what I now knew about my circumstances and what I needed to protect. Patricia said it was the most level-headed conversation about estate planning she had had in a while. I told her it helps when you've already done your grieving. Diane and I speak now, occasionally. It is different than it was before all of this, and I don't know yet if it will find its way back to something warmer. I hope it does. She is my daughter and I love her, and that love does not have conditions attached to it. But trust is different from love. Love you give freely. Trust you rebuild from scratch, slowly, with evidence. We are at the beginning of that, and I am patient. What I am not anymore is silent. That is perhaps the thing I took most from all of this. Not the relief of having my house back. Not even the reclamation of the garage or the mantel or the kitchen table. It was the moment I realized that my silence had not been kindness. I had told myself for months that I was being accommodating, that I was being generous, that good mothers don't make their children feel unwelcome. But accommodation without a voice isn't generosity. It's just absence. And my absence from my own home, from my own needs and spaces and things that didn't protect Diane, it didn't protect the relationship. It just taught everyone, including me, that I could be moved aside. I think about something Gerald used to say. He would say, "Hannah, you don't have to be loud to be heard. You just have to be willing to speak." I was not willing for a long time. I had spent my whole life taking care of other people, patients, my daughter, my husband toward the end, and somewhere in all of that caring, I had misplaced the part of me that was allowed to take up space. The grief made it worse. When you lose someone you love that completely, you shrink a little. You start to feel like you don't deserve as much room as you used to. But I own this house. Not in the way that matters on paper, though it does matter on paper, and I have learned to pay closer attention to what is on paper. I own it in the way that means I have lived inside these walls for 22 years. I painted every room. I chose the tile in the second bathroom. I planted things in that backyard that I have watched grow season by season. This is not just a building with my name on the deed. It is the physical record of my life, and I am still in it. I am 64 years old. I am a retired nurse. I am a widow, and a mother and a woman who has made mistakes and will probably make more. I know the difference now. I can feel it in the way I walk through my own kitchen in the morning. Not quietly, not sideways, not hoping not to disturb anything. Straight through, purposefully, to the cabinet where my mugs are, right in front, where they have always been and where they will stay. This morning, I had my coffee at the kitchen table and the crossword, and then I walked out to the backyard to check on Gerald's roses, which are coming in beautifully this year. I stood under the Japanese maple for a while, the same way I stood there the evening this all came to a head, except differently, not looking for steadiness, just standing there. In the morning, in my yard, on my ground, it felt exactly like what it was. Mine,